Hey, welcome everyone. My name is Karen Narevsky. I'm a contributing editor for Jacobin magazine, and I'm really happy to welcome you all tonight to the latest installment of Stay at Home. This is a video education project from Jacobin magazine. We want to provide a way for people to stay connected and stay educated during the COVID pandemic. And so we're happy to be offering a daily video series. We're having a guest pretty much every night at 6 p.m. Eastern time to discuss an idea or a topic, and then we're going to have a Q&A afterwards with our live YouTube audience. So today's topic is rent control. We're going to be speaking tonight with Cea Weaver, and after she speaks, you'll have an opportunity to ask questions and we'll have some discussion. But before I introduce Cea, I want to make sure you guys know about some of our upcoming events. Tomorrow, so Friday the 10th at 6 p.m., we have a special event with Adolph Reed, Cedric Johnson, and Willie Leggett. It's hosted by Michael Brooks on what went wrong for Bernie Sanders in South Carolina and lessons for the future of the left. And then on Saturday, April 11th, we have two events. At 1 p.m., we have the debut of Weekends with Anna Kasparian and Michael Brooks. And then at 6 p.m., Matt Brunig is going to be doing a lecture on the Nordic model. So we have a lot of events this weekend to keep everyone busy and stimulated. And we really would appreciate it if you guys subscribe to the YouTube channel and share these videos with anyone you think might be interested. We're not fundraising at this time, but we do want you to share the content and invite people to participate and get connected to Jacobin. So please subscribe if you can. And as I said earlier, tonight we have Cea Weaver. She's part of the leadership of New York City DSA, Democratic Socialists of America, and she's also the coordinator of the Housing Justice for All campaign in New York State. This is a coalition that has been fighting for tenants' rights and had some really important victories last year at the state level, and has really been leading the campaign during the pandemic for cancellation of rent. So welcome, Cea. Thanks for being here. And we're looking forward to hearing from you.
Cool. Thank you.
You're welcome. And before you get started, I just want to let everyone know, just as a reminder, if you have questions for Cea that come up while she's talking, feel free to drop them in the comments. And then afterwards, we'll share some of the questions for Cea to answer.
Cool. Hey, everybody. Thank you for having me on this virtual lecture series. So I'm going to talk a little bit about rent control and why progressives and socialists should care about fighting for rent control in 2020. So first, just to tell you a little bit about who I am, and thank you, Karen, for the introduction. I am the campaign coordinator of the Housing Justice for All campaign. We're a coalition of over 70 tenant groups in New York City and New York State. That represent grassroots tenants and homeless New Yorkers in their fight to make housing a human right in New York. So last year, we led a campaign to pass some of the strongest set of tenant protections that New York has ever had. Not the strongest, but they really are some of the strongest tenant protections in about a generation. And now we're fighting to pass a New York homes guarantee, which to us means, eliminating evictions. We believe we can make New York eviction free. We believe that we can eliminate homelessness in our state, and we believe that we need to deeply invest in our public housing. So in that, we are fighting to also expand rent regulations and rent controls, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. In addition to the work that I'm doing in New York State, I am part of the national campaign for a homes guarantee, and I'm a member of New York City DSA's housing working group, and I'm also a recovering urban planner. Urban planning is really just a way to, let real estate developers plan our cities. But, it's important. So I'm going to talk a little bit about rent control today. So, rent control is basically what it sounds like. It is a policy that limits your landlord's ability to pay your rent. So, in New York, where I am, we've had some form of rent control since the early 20th century. It's changed over many times, but the basic facts of it are that in buildings of 6 or more units built before 1974, you have the right to renew your lease, and your rent can only go up a certain amount each year. That amount is set by a board of political appointees who are appointed by the sort of local county executive, or in New York City's case, the mayor. This is our form of rent control in New York City. It's one of the strongest forms of rent control in the country, but there are many different forms and iterations across the entire country. But the basic premise of it is sort of the same. It's that you have the right to renew your lease, and that your landlord does not get to decide how much your rent is going to go up. Rent control is under all sorts of attack. Since the early 1990s and even before, the right wing has been really arguing against rent control and really arguing that it is sort of like fundamentally detrimental to the housing market. I think maybe everybody who's taken an Econ 101 class has gotten a basic lecture about how rent control is making housing paradoxically more expensive. This is a common talking point that the right wing uses to say that rent control decreases production, and that rent control is therefore driving up the cost of housing. It's very untrue, but that's just to tell you how rent control is ideologically sort of like cuts to the core of our country's belief that property is for profit and not property is for housing. So rent control is sort of like a deeply ideological sort of terrain. And those of us who are fighting for rent control are basically fighting for renters' basic rights to have a home. That is something that most people actually don't believe in our country, if they really get down to it, because most people, or many people who are policymakers in this country, really think about property as a vehicle for individual profit. Rent control is not about that. Rent control is about keeping people housed. In the many different forms of rent control across the country, one thing that they sadly often have in common is something called vacancy decontrol. Vacancy decontrol is an idea that was introduced by ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, and I think that's what it stands for. I don't actually know. In the early 1990s, and the idea of vacancy decontrol is that if you live in a rent controlled apartment, when you move out, that apartment pivots to the free market rate. What that leads to is both a massive loss of affordable housing and massive pressure on people who are rent stabilized to leave their homes. So vacancy decontrol means that rent control is designed to self-destruct. So in New York City, we got vacancy decontrol put into our housing laws in the early 90s, but vacancy decontrol exists all across the country wherever rent control exists. And it's a way to eliminate the affordability benefits of rent control and ensure that landlords are really still able to profit from our rental homes. Rent control also is illegal in 36 different states. So in many, many places, there is a ban on passing laws that restrict landlords' ability to unlimitedly profit on our homes. And all of those laws passed around the same time in 1997 based on model legislation that was pushed by the right wing. The good news is that rent control is coming back as a political idea. So just as much as like the economic departments at fancy universities and the real estate industry, which is extremely politically connected, hate to see it. There is a growing movement of renters across the United States that are fighting to lift local bans on rent control and are fighting to put basic sets of tenant protections into place. So there are at least 6 states right now that have active campaigns to strengthen, expand rent control, or lift a ban on rent control. And if those campaigns are successful, 12.7 million people will be rent stabilized by the end of 2020. There are 42 million renters across the United States. And so if we are even more successful than where we currently have a campaign, there's an opportunity to really stably house millions and millions and millions of people. So I also want to talk about like why rent control is so important and why socialists should care about rent control, in addition to like basically what it really is. So rent control, I mean, so socialists and progressives should basically care about any policy that the right wing and that the real estate industry is so afraid of, just in general. Any policy that has a political establishment running the scared should be seen as powerful by us. But besides that, it really keeps people housed. The private homeownership market has really failed to provide housing for many, many, many people, in particular people of color, in particular people who have other types of debt that mean they're not going to be able to take on a mortgage. And I think that the lessons of 2008 to now, and the lessons of 1945 to now, and the lessons of 200 years ago to now have really shown that private homeownership is going to be unable to give people the housing that they deserve. So rent control is a way in which we can like provide renters with basic dignity in the way that our entire political system, which is structured around property owners, fails to do. So rent control is really critical to having a functioning democratic society that like takes into account the people who rent their homes in addition to the people who happen to own. It keeps people housed and it keeps housing affordable. So at a very basic level, rent control can stop your landlord from price gouging you when there's a housing shortage. Rent control can stop people from being pushed out of their homes at a landlord's whim. Rent control in a city and a state and a country that is like characterized by gentrification and sort of speculative investment in land. Rent control can keep people who have been living in a place housed. It means that we have the dignity and we have the opportunity to choose when we want to leave our home or not. Your landlord doesn't really have the ability to just say, hey, I don't like you, so your rent's going to go up $500 if we have rent control. It also gives us some political control, right? Like the people who are able to raise our rents are political appointees who are appointed by our mayor. We elected our mayor, whether we like him or not is a whole other thing. But rent control gives people some sort of control and some sort of like ability to sort of weigh in. And it's not just us versus our landlord, right? There is like a political process that like that is accountable to us, that's deciding how much our rent is going to go up. And that takes a fundamental power away from the real estate market and is terrifying to landlords across the country because they no longer get to choose how much their property is worth and how much they're allowed to charge for your home. Rent control, therefore, is like sort of fundamentally about taking rights away from the real estate industry and giving them to tenants. And I think one of the really fundamental things about rent control that isn't necessarily that understood when we're talking about housing, because rent control is about housing and keeping people housed, but it's also about power, is that rent control is about the right to organize. People often talk about tenant associations and tenant unions and our ability to organize against our landlord in our home. Absent rent control, if you pursue tenant organizing in that way with very, very weak tenant rights, your landlord has the ability to retaliate against you. Rent control is not just about your rent going up. It's also about the right to renew your lease. And it's also about our ability to form unions in our buildings or in our neighborhoods to fight against our landlords who are increasingly corporate players to demand that we can win things from them directly. Whether it's concessions in our lease, whether it's something that we want to see happen in our building, like repairs or something else like that, rent control gives us the protection to form tenant unions to like target and win things directly from our landlords. So that's a very, very critical thing that socialists and progressives should care about. Similar to like a right to form a union in your workplace, rent control is also about forming the right to form a union where you live. So that's critically important. Renter justice is a cross-race, cross-class, and cross-generational concern. About half of New York State rents and an increasing share of the population rents, but our housing policy doesn't take that into concern at all. So rent control is a place where we can organize in an incredibly diverse way with people who are older than us, who look different from us, who are all impacted by the same really exploitative property system, and and that means that we have an opportunity to greatly expand our movement, right? I once heard somebody in a meeting I was in, someone said that everyone's a socialist when it comes to their landlord. I think that that's probably true, and so we have an opportunity to introduce a lot of new people to socialist politics and progressive politics through organizing for rent control in our communities. And then finally, rent control makes up other things that we care about: public housing, community land trusts, non-speculative housing models more possible. When your landlord has the right to just raise rents like crazy, the speculative value of the land is extremely, it's limitless. And so that means that banks and private equity companies and corporations are snapping up houses and buildings in cities across the country. But if we can pass strong rent controls, we are effectively able to undermine the real estate industry's goals to just limitlessly profit on our homes and limitlessly profit based on displacement and evictions and gentrification. So rent control is really about our ability to undermine the real estate industry's goals of pushing us out. That's why they hate it. That's why they have spent millions and millions of dollars fighting it in cities across the country. And that's why they spent millions and millions of dollars of buying state houses and buying state assembly seats and governor's races and state senate seats in places across the entire country. The real estate industry in New York and in many other places is one of the most prolific donors to state and local politics. And that's because they're so afraid of rent control, as they are focused on evicting as a way to raise property values, which is not in line with our values. So by reducing the speculative value of the asset, the land, we're able to actually sort of undermine the real estate industry, to tank the real estate industry, and to make things like community land trusts and other community controlled forms of housing a lot more possible. Absent rent control, we are not going to be able to do that. It really is the first step that opens the door to tons and tons and tons more possibilities. So there are a lot of facts and myths about rent control that in part are really driven to us from pretty conservative institutions across the country, and they are basically all lies. So I'm just going to talk through what some of the facts and myths about rent control are, and we will open it up to questions. So the first that most people have probably heard is that rent control will make housing more expensive because it decreases production overall. That is basically completely untrue. Multiple studies over time have found that there is really no discernible impact on construction rates thanks to rent control. In general, this is because new housing, there's two reasons. One is that rent control typically only applies to older buildings, buildings in New York City, buildings that are built before 1974. So if you built a new building in New York City, it wouldn't be covered by rent control anyway, except that, wait a second, they are. Almost all buildings that are built in New York City and in many places across the country are built with other significant government investments, like taxes, like free taxes. Like in New York, almost nobody pays property tax. No big real estate companies pay property taxes because our cities and our states are so laser focused on incentivizing construction through property tax abatements or other types of direct subsidies to the real estate industry, that those units are sort of regulated and controlled in some way anyway. So the idea that rent control is going to discourage landlords from building new housing is a myth that doesn't take into account the many other types of regulations that exist in our cities, the overall market conditions, zoning, property taxes, and many other things. In addition, there's been one study out of Boston, one of the places that, in Cambridge actually, that repealed rent control, that said after the repeal of rent control, construction rates actually decreased in multifamily buildings and rents doubled over 8 years. So there's basically no real correlation that exists between a decrease in production of housing and rent control, but that is a myth that persists like crazy, and it's really just, I think, because people lie, and lie pervasively with like PhDs to back them up. So rent control, another thing that people say is that by regulating some parts of the market and not other parts of the market, rent control causes the rents in unregulated units to increase faster. Therefore, it applies benefits to people unevenly. In particular, it applies benefits to rich people who might live in rent-controlled housing, while poor people who live in unregulated housing suffer. So there's sort of two parts to this myth. The first is that there's like a lot of like celebrities living like, you know, Monica and Rachel and Friends in like a rent controlled apartment in the West Village. That's a total myth. The average rent controlled apartment income in New York City is around $40,000 a year. It's the largest source of affordable housing to working class people in New York City. There's about 1 million rent controlled apartments in New York City, and without it, working class people would be screwed. So that's the first part of the myth. And the second part, it's clear over many studies from Massachusetts, California, New Jersey, and New York, places that actually have rent control, that the existence of rent control has no discernible impact on rents increasing in non-regulated units. So the problem is not rent control. The problem is that landlords are incentivized to push people out of their homes so that they can raise the rent. Another myth about rent control is that it leads to declines in maintenance and housing conditions. Because your landlord can't raise the rent for making repairs, they're not going to come and make repairs, and rent control means that our apartments will get shoddy and shabby. So this is a crazy myth because, as anyone knows, landlords who are motivated by profit and profit alone are not going to make repairs for us. And by giving tenants the right to organize in their buildings, which rent control does, tenants are able to affirmatively seek repairs from their landlords without the fear of being displaced. So from New York City in the 1970s to New York City today, where we had like the sort of most stable form of rent control, housing conditions have improved dramatically, in part because tenants have been able to organize for better living conditions where they live, more investment in things like code enforcement. And so there's actually no discernible, there's no evidence that shows that rent control would lead to a decrease in investment in housing. In fact, in Washington, D.C., the share of physically deficient units quickly declined after rent stabilization was implemented, and 60% of tenants said that they were more willing to insist on and fight for repairs. So many of the myths that people tell us about rent control are not true. Rent control is a wonderful policy that could stabilize like millions and millions and millions of households across the United States. And then the last thing I will say before I get out of the way and start to answer some questions is that eviction is destroying people's lives, and rent control is the number one way to prevent eviction. So 1 in 5 Black women are evicted from their homes at some point in their lifetime. If you are evicted when you are in middle school, that will destroy your life basically forever. Evictions has a lifelong impact on people's abilities to learn and thrive and grow and succeed and just generally live a stable life. And so rent control, by preventing evictions and giving people the right to stay in their rental home, is the number one thing that we can do to address all sorts of things, including the sort of racial wealth gap between Black and white families. White families, of course, have had an immense amount of help from the federal government at becoming homeowners, something that is not true for Black families. And so rent control is a really important policy to sort of limit racial inequality in the housing market. So that's all I have about rent control, and I am looking forward to your questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Sia. That's really great. It's kind of interesting to me, like when you were talking about some of the myths that come up around rent control, a lot of them seem to parallel the way that people talk about other, major social programs, like healthcare or education. Um, but I think in this country, we really are not used to thinking of housing as a social program. We're used to thinking of it as a commodity and like something that can be profited from. So it's been interesting in this moment where decommodification of these public programs is now like on the table politically. Um, to really see that shift at the national level. And so I know you've been involved with the National Homes Guarantee campaign. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what that looks like, and also about the fact that I think Bernie Sanders was the first presidential candidate, certainly in my lifetime, but maybe ever, to have national rent control as part of his platform. And is that what we should be demanding of our national politicians in this moment?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, we need. So I think a fundamental thing is that we have had a federal housing policy that is just entirely structured around how can people become homeowners, and that means that we are leaving more than half of the people in this country out. And so Bernie Sanders is definitely the first presidential candidate in my lifetime too. I mean, I guess we're not really that old, to really center renters in his housing policy. And so, in addition to lifting state bans on rent control and passing a national rent control policy and a national right to renew your lease policy, Bernie Sanders also called for a deep investment in public and social housing. One of the, which I think is another thing we need to be deeply demanding, what we are seeing is we're seeing a reignited belief in the public sector and the public sector's ability to provide the things that people need to live, like housing and healthcare and education. So both the call for national rent control, the call for an investment in public and social housing are really critical components of the Sanders housing platform that I'd like to see continued beyond the Sanders campaign. And I know that people are going to keep organizing for those things. In particular, Ilhan Omar, AOC, and Rashida Tlaib have introduced a package of bills that would that really form the basis of Sanders' housing platform that we're still going to organize for, and hope that we can get passed through Congress. In addition to that, I guess like and then in addition to that, one of the ways that Bernie talked about ownership was really interesting and inspiring to me. When we talk about ownership and when we talk about housing and housing stability, we often say that we want home ownership because that is the only way that we know that we'll be able to stay stable in our homes, and because ownership means to us that we'll be able to like pass something on to our children. That's sort of what we mean when we say ownership. And one of the things that I thought was really inspiring about Bernie's housing platform was when Bernie talked about ownership, he talked about collective community ownership. And he talked about not just what I would pass on to my children, it's about what we as like a collective community are passing on to the people who will live here beyond us too, our like our shared responsibility and our shared responsibility to steward the land. And to me, that is like a small but deeply ideological and deeply important difference between how Bernie sees housing compared to how many other like non-movement politicians see housing. I mean, like Joe Biden's housing plan is about like how can we get more first-time home buyers, and getting more first-time home buyers doesn't actually address the problem that we have. The problem that we have is that if we continue to treat this as like an individual me thing, like I need housing, and we're never going to be able to solve the scale of the crisis, or we're never going to be able to meet the scale of the crisis. And it's kind of crazy. And one last thing that just your question reminded me of, like the way that we approach housing, let's think about like any other social program if we would feel comfortable with that. So if I told you, Karen, that like I know you don't have kids, but if you had kids and I told you that we were gonna tell you you can't live where you live anymore, and you can't send your kid to the public school on the corner anymore, but I'm gonna give you $500 a month and you should find a place to go send your kid to school. It's sort of crazy. And it's sort of the same thing. Like we're going to shut down the New York City subway, but like here's a voucher, buy a car. It's sort of crazy the way that like we talk about housing is like very individualized, and we wouldn't apply that to any other field really. But because it's so property and housing are so linked with profit and individualism, it's hard for us to see that what we're saying about housing is crazy.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, there's like a whole other kind of discussion to be had here about the ways in which people's personal finances and their, their sort of financial security is bound up in their housing, especially if they're homeowners.
Yeah.
They're depending on their home to send their kids to college or to retire or whatever. And so we really have like not only turned housing into a commodity, but we've turned it into this sort of like personal financial instrument that makes everybody very dependent on
The
the
private market.
in a really, really negative way. Uh,
Yeah, it's really depressing. And, we are in a generation that's part of the reason why there is a movement of renters in this moment, though, I think. Like for white families, this is something that has never been true for Black families, so we should just say that. But for white families, the mode has always been you become a homeowner by the time you're like 30 or whatever, and you use that to pay for your health care, to pay for your retirement, to pay for your kids' education. You use it to pay for everything. But for our generation of people, we are saddled with student loan debt. We're saddled with medical debt, some of us maybe. And the idea that and we like graduated from college or whatever at a time when like the housing market was in total crisis. And the idea that we're just going to like go to a bank and get a mortgage is like sort of laughable. So I think that like generationally, what we've seen happen in the housing market over the last 20 years has meant that there's a whole new class of people who are our generation, young people who are never going to become homeowners. And that is leading us to see there are many, many aspects of American society that make no sense whatsoever, including our healthcare system, including our education system, including our housing system. And that is really, I think, sort of fundamental to the housing movement that we're seeing pop up right now.
Totally. Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And it also, I mean, it for me kind of brings up the point that, a lot of people think that rent control is just an issue for like California and New York and places where rents are really expensive. But I think one of the things that's becoming clear is that you have predatory landlords in every state. So like rents may be lower, but it doesn't mean that landlords aren't taking advantage of people. A lot of people who we've learned this in New York State who rent space in a mobile home park. They may own their home, but they don't own the land, and they're subject to predatory landlords as well. So I think it really kind of like reinforces the need for
Absolutely.
rent.
Yeah,
And so,
there's more evictions in Richmond, Virginia than any other part of the country.
wow. So on that note of like what different states are doing, I know you mentioned that there are many states where rent control is actually outlawed by the state constitution. But we have a question from Danny Howell asking if we live in a state that has not banned rent control, should we be organizing for rent control or for just cause eviction protections? Like what's the strategy for tenants on the ground in those states?
Yeah. So I think that an important component, I think you should be organizing for rent control. And I think that an important component of rent control is just cause eviction protection. So they go hand in hand, right? So if you have rent control, you also have the right to renew your lease, which should include all sorts of good cause eviction protection. So my advice as like organizer is like go for what you really want. And what you really want is rent control. If you like lead with I just want good cause, it's likely that you will win some watered down version of good cause. We should be going for the strongest, most universal form of rent control that we really want and on the path to get that. And that's what we should say we want because that's what we need. And on the path to get that, they may give us some other reforms like good cause on the way. But I mean, why choose? You don't have to choose. You can ask for both.
Maybe
or one includes the other.
Yeah, and for folks maybe who aren't as clued in, like the idea behind just cause eviction protections, it's pretty simple. It's that your landlord can't evict you without just cause. So they can't evict you because they don't like you or because of your race or because you like left your sock in the hallway or whatever. It means that you can only be evicted if you actually have like violated the terms of your lease or if you like pose some kind of danger, whatever to public safety.
And some states have good cause that don't have rent control. The difference between rent control and good cause is that rent control is good cause, plus your landlord doesn't get to choose how much your rent goes up.
Yeah. And so actually this is like a good transition because good cause eviction was actually a big piece of the campaign that happened over the last few years in New York State, led to the Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act of 2019. And so it would be great, Cea, if you could talk a little bit more about that campaign and like why was the tenant movement in New York State able to successfully win such a major shift in the rent laws, and what were some of the challenges that prevented the movement from from winning even more?
Yeah, good question. And I don't know.
Sure, you haven't thought about this at all, so.
Okay, so I think that, rent control in New York was under attack for many, many, many decades. And in 2017, we formed the Housing Justice for All campaign. And what we thought in that moment, and you have to remember in 2017, what had just happened was like Trump had just been elected. And Trump, in addition to being like a horrible fascist, is a New York City landlord. And so, we were like, wow, like this is like the rise of real estate politics in New York to like the highest office. We had a Republican controlled state legislature, and Andrew Cuomo, although a lot of people now are like, oh, he's so great, is a Republican basically, and is controlled by the real estate industry, and isn't even doing a good job at COVID, which is like a whole other thing, but he's literally leaving people to die. But so 2017, we were like, wow, like this is where rent regulation was expiring on June 15th, 2019. And we formed this coalition because we were terrified that we were not at all prepared for expiration. We thought that if we didn't come together stronger than ever before, rent control would just disappear. The real estate industry would get rid of it forever. The real estate industry is, more powerful than oil in Texas and New York. It is the most politically powerful industry in our state by far. And so they have for many, many years kept Republicans in control of the state legislature through basically a swing group of 8 Democrats who caucused with Republicans. So in 2017, we came together to say, one, we're not going to be on the defensive in 2019. We are going to fight to say what we really want, which is we want universal rent control. We want to expand what we want so that every New Yorker in New York State has the right to renew their lease at a rent that they can afford. New York had rent control just in New York City and the surrounding 3 counties, but there's millions of renters across the whole state. So we said, we don't just want it in New York City, we want it everywhere. In addition, we said, we don't just want it for buildings with 6 or more units. We want it for every single apartment in New York City and in New York State that's rented, every single home. So no matter how many units are in my building, we want it to be rent controlled. And we decided that we needed to bring in homeless New Yorkers, and we needed to say that rent control is about stopping evictions, and stopping evictions is about ending homelessness. There's 92,000 homeless New Yorkers in New York State. So it was really critical for us that when we're talking about tenants' rights, we're also talking about people who lost their homes because tenants' rights are so weak. So we went on the offensive like crazy, and we did 2 things. In addition to like making really bold demands and not being afraid to back down from them and expanding the base, the other thing that we did is we really tried to politicize the idea of tenants' rights. And so we did that in a couple ways. One is that we ran people for office directly out of the tenant movement. So they ran refusing to take real estate money to fund their campaign. So State Senator Julia Salazar, State Senator Zelma Myrie, and also Jumaane Williams and Cynthia Nixon, who ran for governor and lieutenant governor in our state. And so those folks were running on a universal rent control tenant justice platform all through 2018. And so that really set the tone for what would happen when we came into the legislative session in 2019. So now we expanded the base, we went on the offensive, we electoralized the issue. And then when we sort of came into office in 2019, we had done all of those things, and that meant that the newly progressive legislature which did a lot of things that were not progressive, especially this last year. This is more evident now than ever before, felt deeply accountable to tenants' rights. So then we were able to just be up there every Tuesday, fighting like hell in Albany in public and on like social media, and mobilizing thousands and thousands of renters to the Capitol every week. They were elected with a mandate to pass stronger tenant controls, stronger rent controls. That is not true of other issues. They passed weak public financing. They didn't end solitary confinement. And this year in 2020, they passed the shittiest state budget our state has ever had. So it's not like we elected progressives to office and we were good. It was that we elected progressives to office with a mandate to be accountable to the tenant movement from the tenant movement, refusing to take money from the real estate industry, and then polarize the entire legislature against the role that the real estate industry plays in politics. And that really set the stage for how we won. But we didn't win everything. So we did expand rent control to cover the whole state, but we didn't win good cause eviction, which is the main bill that we were fighting for that would have expanded rent controls to smaller buildings. So rent control, tenants still only have rights in buildings with 6 or more units. So if you live in New York State, so if you live in a 4-unit building in New York City, you basically don't have any tenants' rights. And so we still need to fight to like make sure that those folks are covered by tenant protections.
Thank you.
And there's like so much to say about how the New York State legislature is, but those are the headlines.
Yep. And what do you think, just to follow up on the good cause eviction question, like obviously there was a ton that was accomplished, and this was like a really galvanizing moment for tenants, not just in New York, but I think pretty inspiring to people in other states as well. What are some of the challenges? Obviously, the real estate industry took a big hit in those reforms that were passed last year, but they're not going anywhere. What are some of the lessons that tenant organizers should be taking to the fights in their cities and states that we learned from last year?
So I think that it's very important that tenant organizers build a movement beyond like the handful of sort of like inside game movement politicians that exist. Like it was really helpful. So the Housing Justice for All campaign had it, just to like give a little bit of background on who we are. We're 70 organizations across the state with a 13-member steering committee. But in addition to the members of those organizations, we really had developed such like a strong outside like media game that there were like millions of people out there who like we don't even know who were following what was going on with the universal rent control movement in New York. And that we felt accountable to them, because we knew that we couldn't go and take some like bad deal, because if we did, we wouldn't be able to control the extremely negative reaction. So what is important here in a lesson to me is that like if you're doing your job right as an organizer, you're going to spur a movement, and that movement is not going to be something that you can control. So the movement, the lesson is like, you don't need the best campaign plan. You need the best message, the best values. You need to like know what you're fighting for and fight for it. And to not get distracted by like the inside Albany politics or whatever your state house is. Go on the offensive, like call out when the real estate industry is calling the shots. Like don't be afraid to call that out, because if you think that you can control the campaign plan rigidly, and you're not accountable to like the millions of renters out there in the world, you don't have the power to win. And so there was a key moment when one of the bills that would have like really limited landlords' abilities to raise rent was a bill that would limit the rent increases that you can get for capital improvements to your building. And we wanted to just fully eliminate rent increases for major capital improvements. And under that legislation, landlords would no longer be able to raise the rent if they put in a new boiler, or no longer be able to raise the rent if they put on a new roof. And it's pretty common, like people are like, oh, it's not fair to landlords if like they put in a new boiler. And so we would say things like, okay, well, like we're going to pay for the boiler, and then I guess we'll take that with us when we move out, right? Like, it's sort of like the common knowledge here. It's sort of funny to think about. But there was a key moment when we knew we weren't going to be able to eliminate MCIs. We knew, we had heard from the state legislature, like, that was not going to happen. They maybe would make some reforms so that the rent increase wouldn't be quite so high, but we weren't going to eliminate MCIs. And we had to decide, do we want to go to the table and negotiate what those reforms are and tell them, like, what our best deal is? Or do we want to just stay on the outside and keep saying, eliminate MCIs, eliminate MCIs, eliminate MCIs? Like, and we decided to stay on the outside. And we didn't ever go to the table, and we didn't ever really talk to the legislature about what we wanted to see them do in that exact moment on that exact bill. And that was really scary for some of us, because we were like, wow, what if there were reforms that they pass are bad? And like, we're the experts, and like, we could get good reforms or bad reforms on the path to like something better. And that was a challenge. That was a challenging moment, and we didn't all agree, and we didn't all know if we were making the right choice. But we made the choice to stay on the outside. We made the choice to be accountable to the millions of people who have been following our movement to eliminate MCIs, and it was the right thing to do.
Great. Thank you so much, Cea. I just want to like highlight some of the things that you said in that last response, because I think it's really important, and I want folks to keep this in mind as you guys continue organizing folks who are doing that in the spaces where you live, like the importance of knowing when to stay on the outside, knowing that this is not really about like becoming best friends with elected officials, but also knowing like what happened in New York was that people really did get organic candidates to run and then continue to hold them accountable after they were elected to office, and push them to use their mandate. And I think the idea of accountability, not just with elected officials, but also with tenants and with people who are broadly affected by the policies that we're fighting for, is really important in order to build the movement that we need. So I want to thank.
And another
Yeah, sorry.
thing is our movements are like, our orgs are relatively small. Like, we were mobilizing like probably like 3,000 renters at any given time, but there's 5 million of them in New York. And so how can we be speaking to people who aren't members of our organizations? Like, how are we building a movement that's accountable to people who we just don't even know?
Right. And that's what we mean, right? When we say the tenant movement, it's not just about like the people that we know or who are members of our organizations. It's really about trying to build those connections and build that accountability with tenants, like as a class or as a whole.
Yeah.
So thanks so much, Cea, for joining us. Cea was part of the housing issue of Jacobin that came out in June of 2019. It's issue 33. I encourage folks to check it out. She also referenced the fact that our current president is actually a landlord himself and has deep ties to the New York State real estate industry. And if folks have not already looked at Real Estate State by Sam Stein, which is part of the Jacobin Verso series, there's a lot more on that relationship that I would encourage folks to take a look at. So I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. As I mentioned, we're doing these almost every evening at 6 p.m. So please subscribe to the YouTube channel, share the videos, join us tomorrow evening and over the weekend. And thanks everyone for joining us. And thank you, Cea.
Thank you. See you soon.